Even though billions of people profess faith in him, there are quite a few misconceptions about Jesus Christ. From the basics of his appearance to popular beliefs about his theology, a number of surprises are in store. These are the things many people get wrong about Jesus. Even though a major world religion centers on him, there's surprisingly little direct evidence that clues us into what Jesus really looked like. And if you happen to abide by the classic images of Jesus, that is, classic as defined by centuries of European-influenced art making, then chances are your internal image of Jesus is all wrong. According to history, the biblical evidence about Jesus' appearance is practically non-existent. We know that he would have been around 30 years old when he started making waves as a religious leader. It's also pretty reasonable to conclude that he was a normal-looking guy for the time, so standard issue that Judas Iscariot had to point him out when it came time for Jesus' arrest.
Arrest him.
It doesn't help that Western art has changed its depiction of Jesus many times over the years, often depending more on cultural trends and personal preferences of the artist than documented fact. That said, we can make some reasonable conclusions about his appearance, extrapolating from common traits seen around the region at the time. In the book, What Did Jesus Look Like?, academic Joan E. Taylor advances an educated guess that Jesus likely had curly hair, dark eyes, and brown skin, much like other people in his community. It is often presumed that Jesus began his life as a humble carpenter, working with his hands in obscurity before he became a major religious figure. However, the use of the word carpenter isn't quite right here. There are really only two verses, Mark 6:3 and Matthew 13:55, that even bother to reference Jesus' occupation or that of Joseph. It seemingly wasn't that important to the writers of the Gospels. And when that occupation is mentioned in the original Greek text of the early Gospels, the word tekton is used, according to the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. As Architectural Histories reports, the job description of a tekton can include plenty of woodworking, but it doesn't necessarily mean carpenter. Rather, a tekton has been defined in any number of ways, with jobs that can encompass carpentry work, but is more tied to the work of a general builder. It may be more accurate to think of Jesus and Joseph as general contractors working in Nazareth. It appears that we got to carpenter because when English translations of the Bible started to debut, there was already an established tradition of referring to Jesus as a carpenter, despite the lack of clear biblical evidence. So many Christians celebrate the birth of Christ every year on December 25th, but what if he wasn't born on that date? If you traveled back in time to the first few centuries after Jesus' death, you'd be hard-pressed to find any celebration of his birth, much less one taking place around that time of the year. According to history, the oldest known record of a Christmas-like celebration is an observation of the Nativity that took place in Rome in 336 AD. Before that, no one claimed to know at what time of year Jesus had been born, nor did it seem to concern them very much. Easter, which commemorates Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, was considered far more central to the Christian celebratory calendar. Later, theologians would contend that God had created the world on the spring equinox, implying that Jesus was probably conceived around the same time of the year, the lack of biblical support notwithstanding. There's no directly stated reason why early church leaders picked December 25th as the holiday, but it's worth noting that the Feast of the Annunciation is March 25th. That's the day Catholics celebrate Mary becoming pregnant. Add 9 months to that and you get December 25th. Another commonly reported fact is that Christmas lines up with pagan festivals like the Roman Saturnalia, which themselves tend to occur around the winter solstice. Saturnalia actually ended on the 23rd, so the dates don't really line up, but it's still commonly thought that Christmas is on the 25th because of a pagan holiday. It's not. We don't really know specifically why Christmas is celebrated on December 25th. History reports that scholars commonly agree there was a real historical Jesus. However, the complicated truth is that direct evidence for his existence is frustratingly hard to come across. So while we can be reasonably certain that there was once a religious leader named Jesus who lived in what is now Israel around the 1st century, things after that point get murky pretty quickly. First, there's no officially verified archaeological evidence for Jesus, meaning that no one has yet found any tangible things that are without a doubt connected to the man. Yes, this means that even long-venerated religious relics like the supposed crown of thorns traditionally housed in Notre Dame Cathedral or bits of the so-called true cross displayed elsewhere are unconfirmed as relics associated with Jesus. But what about documentary evidence? That avenue has proven more useful, though not exactly fruitful. Some non-biblical writers did confirm a few spare details of Jesus' life. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian living in the 1st century, offers up one of the earliest such accounts. In his Jewish Antiquities, he writes of a man named James who was unfairly executed, mentioning that the victim is the brother of, quote, Jesus who is called Messiah. yet a longer account may have been doctored by later Christian editors. Another brief mention comes in the Annals of Imperial Rome, where historian Tacitus refers to a man who, by the 2nd century, was called Christos. Quite a few depictions of Jesus over the centuries have shown him with long hair. Perhaps a bunch of artists have just found that image more exciting than showing him with short hair. And as it turns out, the long hair of Jesus in so many depictions may not have anything to do with historical fact. According to the BBC, having a big old beard and long hair was traditionally the mark of a Greek or Roman god, such as Zeus. Everyday men at the time would have been far more likely to have short hair. In fact, the earliest known images of Jesus from the 3rd century show him in just such a manner. A beard might not have been totally out of the question, though. If Jesus were busy traveling for his preaching, he may not have had time to visit a barber and could have developed something of a beard. But long hair would have certainly marked him out as a member of a group known as the Nazarites. Yet, because no one ever claimed Jesus was a Nazarite and because he drank wine, another no-no for Nazarites, we can make a reasonable conclusion that he had short hair and, at most, a short beard like everyone else. Jesus was, by many modern accounts and retellings of his story, a generally loving guy who preached peace and togetherness during his time on earth. On its face, that can't be totally disputed, as there are plenty of Bible verses where Jesus tells people to love one another. According to Christianity.com, he's also commonly known in Christian circles as the Prince of Peace. But it would be a mistake to assume that Jesus was a meek, thoroughly chill dude who gave out blanket kindness. In fact, as Got Questions relates, there are plenty of biblical verses that reveal far more nuance in his emotions. There's the incident where he overturned some tables and upset moneylenders working in Jerusalem's temple, a story so striking that it's mentioned in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, says the Lord. But you have made it a den of thieves.
He was also known to get frustrated at people who weren't meeting him halfway with his teachings, as when the Pharisee fundamentalist wouldn't answer his questions in Mark 3:1-5. According to Got Questions, Jesus' anger wasn't a bad thing. No Bible verses really indicate that his emotions ever tipped over into uncontrolled rage, though the moneylenders may have argued otherwise at the time. Neither is there any textual evidence that Jesus stewed over his anger and allowed it to become a grudge. For many believing Christians, while this may be a surprising point of Jesus' actions and personality, his anger appears righteous. Though it's the name many of us know him by today, the 1st century Jewish religious leader and prophet who is now called Jesus would never have heard that name applied to him during his lifetime. According to PBS's Origin of Everything, his original Hebrew name was actually Yeshua. If we were to translate that to a more modern form, the originator of Christianity would more accurately have gone by the name Joshua. So how did we get to Jesus? It's all due to the Greek language employed in the New Testament. His name went from Yeshua to Jesus, mainly because Greek just didn't have the same characters to handle the sound of the original Hebrew. Jesus, which rather easily became Jesus down the line, was their best approximation. As Slate reports, Yeshua would have faced the same problem borne by modern kids with popular names. A bunch of people in the region apparently were named Yeshua. It certainly pops up often in the Hebrew Bible, though those individuals often become Joshua in later translations. Furthermore, just from the time of Jesus' crucifixion, excavators have uncovered over 70 tombs bearing that name. Not only does that make it incredibly hard to find archaeological evidence of Jesus' tomb, which would be an absolutely groundbreaking discovery for biblical scholars, but it also underlies just how common and unremarkable Jesus may have seemed upon first glance. Given how many stories there are of Jesus' life, including those in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'd think we'd have some confirmed contemporary reports of his comings and goings. But we really don't. We've got some accounts written within a few generations or so of Jesus' time, just like that of Josephus. When it comes to eyewitness accounts from people who actually met the man, things get pretty shaky. Speaking to NPR, religion professor Bart D. Ehrman notes that we can't be so sure that the Gospels were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Instead, it's quite possible that later writers simply attached the names of the apostles to their work. If they were actually written by the people in question, then why are there so many significant differences between the details of the Gospels, like whether or not Jesus was divine? Perhaps most significantly, there's no language in any of the Gospels that clearly indicates the writer was there as a witness. The faithful may argue against this idea, but looking at things strictly in reference to the books in the New Testament, there's no confirmed proof that the apostles or anyone else who was part of Jesus' inner circle ever wrote down their accounts. Contrary to some modern folks' expectations, there was practically no way Jesus would have thought of himself as a Christian. First of all, as the BBC reports, the Christ part of Jesus Christ was not an actual feature of his name. It actually is a Greek word related to the Hebrew term for Messiah, and is effectively translated as Anointed One. That title really caught on after Jesus' death, according to Britannica. Moreover, PBS's Frontline contends that Jesus would have been very likely to see himself as a Jewish person. He was born in a Jewish community to a Jewish family and would have been intimately familiar with the various laws and practices of Judaism in the first century. As Professor Shay J.D. Cohen argues, even the Gospels tactically assume that Jesus was Jewish, with nary a mention of him starting a new religious movement, much less one that would be called Christianity. For Jesus and everyone around him, it's far more certain that he was seen as someone with a unique connection to God, but not as an individual in the process of breaking away from established Jewish tradition. It's only after that religious movement grew from a Jewish sect into independent Christianity over the following centuries that anyone would think of him as something more. Jesus is both a religious figure and a real historical person who lived in the 1st century AD. Scholars have long scoured archaeological and historical records for evidence of how he really lived. This is the untold truth of Jesus. Jesus preached a form of peaceful resistance that often gets misinterpreted. He's often associated with advocating for turning the other cheek, but he actually taught powerful lessons about resistance. Jews suffered under Roman rule in Palestine, and there were different approaches for confronting the situation.
Peter, turn the other cheek.
Some chose to live by the sword as zealots or assassins. Others, like the Essenes, fled to caves where they copied and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. Still others, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, attempted to maintain leadership roles and prestige by cooperating with Roman authorities to various degrees. Jesus' advice for people living through these tumultuous times was for peaceful resistance. As noted by biblical scholar Dr. Walter Wink, Jesus specifically references getting slapped on the right cheek, which implies the slapper used the back of his right hand. But if the person being slapped turned the other cheek, it would force the person committing the violence to use the back of their left hand. In other words, it would cause the slapper to admit their action was unclean, as the left hand was reserved for unclean tasks like going to the bathroom. Jesus came from a Jewish family and taught as a rabbi. He didn't talk about starting a new religion, and he kept the Mosaic laws, feasts, and traditions of Judaism, as his family had for generations. According to religious scholar Shay J.D. Cohen, to say that Jesus was a Jew is saying a truism, is simply stating an idea that is so obvious on the face of it, one wonders if it even needs to be said. But of course it does need to be said, because we all know what happens later in the story, where it turns out that Christianity becomes something other than Judaism. We also know that historians such as Josephus referred to the followers of Jesus as being from the tribe of Christians, and those believers called themselves followers of the way. Therefore, it bears repeating that the early message of Jesus should be viewed through the lens of 1st century Judaism. As widely known as the name Jesus is, if you could travel back to 1st century Roman Palestine, nobody would know who you were talking about if you actually asked for Jesus, because this name comes from the Greco-Roman Jesus. But in Hebrew, it's Yeshua, meaning to deliver or to rescue. It provides an important perspective on this historical figure. It was a popular name at the time, as archaeologists have discovered the tombs of 71 people named Yeshua. There are 30 references to the name in the Old Testament concerning 4 different characters. While some people might see this as a contentious issue, it's really a matter of a translation issue. Either way, we ought to cut the first translators of the New Testament some slack. After all, the modern languages that we speak today didn't exist yet. And what about Jesus' last name? It wouldn't have been Christ, a title that translated as the Anointed One or King. Contemporaries of Jesus either used their father's name or their home region to denote their identity. So when translated into English, he would be either Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus, son of Joseph. Jesus ended up being crucified by the Roman Empire on charges of sedition because of his teachings about the kingdom of heaven. Crucifixion was so brutal that only non-Roman citizens were punished this way. It represented the Romans' ultimate political weapon, instilling terror into anyone who thought twice about sedition. Best-selling author Stephen Mansfield described it in a 2014 article. Crucifixion represented, quote, an act of state terror. Before stumbling upon this horrific form of punishment, the Roman Empire tested many other torture methods, everything from stoning, strangling, burning, and boiling in oil. So what made them settle on crucifixion for so many Jewish men of this time? It sent a lingering, painful, and very visual message. How did this nasty practice get started in the first place? It likely began with the Assyrians or Babylonians. By the 6th century BC, the historical record shows that the Persians also practiced crucifixion, but these punishments occurred on trees rather than wooden crosses. The later development of the wooden cross came about thanks to the Romans. But how did they stumble across this punishment, especially considering their lack of interaction with the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians? As it turned out, they encountered it when they fought against Carthage during the 3rd century BC Punic Wars. As the saying goes, children are the future. As a society, we tend to celebrate their curiosity, innocence, and overall cuteness. But growing up in the Roman world remained a vicious and precarious endeavor. Infants were routinely left outside to die of exposure, and selling them into slavery and prostitution were also commonplace. In essence, minors had no rights. Therefore, as The Week argued in a 2015 article, Christianity invented children. This happened not only by protecting their lives, but also by ascribing special worth to them. And it all started with Jesus' teachings. Besides setting a new precedent for how children should be valued, the New Testament also spoke about the ancient world's preponderance toward overlooking and mistreating one of the world's most vulnerable populations. This lesson also extended beyond children to all individuals facing abuse due to their class, identity, and background.
You, all of you, are to be special.
Jesus consistently taught about the importance of individual rights, and he stood up for oppressed members of society. He gained a negative reputation among the religious elites of the day for rubbing elbows with the likes of sinners, lepers, sex workers, tax collectors, beggars, and Samaritans. In a time when rabbis wouldn't help an injured person for fear of becoming unclean, Jesus set a rigorous standard for caring based on the concept that all people are equally important in God's eyes. He also earned a reputation for hanging out with the people that society cast aside. According to Brad Chilcott, writing for The Guardian in 2017, Jesus was overtly on the side of the poor, the excluded, the ignored, the disenfranchised, and the exploited. He was on their side when it damaged his reputation, his earning potential, and any hope he had of moving up the ranks of religious or political power. Jesus set a rigorous standard for the downtrodden and how they should be treated. No wonder, then, that he ended up running afoul of the religious and political authorities of the region. As further argued by Chilcott, Jesus was on their side when he drove out the price manipulators and rent seekers in the temple courts, and he was on their side when it cost him his life. Like children, women occupied the bottom of the social totem pole during Jesus' time. Nowhere did this prove more true than within the confines of 1st century Judaism, where women were stoned to death for little more than accusations of adultery. But Jesus operated against the norm as he regularly addressed women in public at a time when they remained generally ignored by men and were treated as second-class citizens. In the way that Jesus spoke to women, he afforded them spiritual equality with men, and he treated them as individuals with a degree of self-determination over their own lives. As Liberty University professor James A. Borland wrote in Crossway in 2017, Jesus' regard for women was much different than that of his contemporaries. For Christ, women have an intrinsic value equal to that of men. The reason that Jesus treated women so radically different than his 1st century peers was because he saw them as people first. His actions exemplified his belief system. He conversed with women in public, something many Jewish religious leaders would have avoided, and he made them a vital focus of his healing ministry. He also collected a massive following of female believers and treated his mother with a level of respect and care not typical of his day. Inspired by his life and teachings, the New Testament also placed a significant focus on women. The book of Luke, for example, often explores Jesus' ministry from the point of view of the women around him. At this point, it's not an exaggeration to say that compassion didn't abound in the Roman Empire. In a world where fathers killed their kids and even their wives without repercussions, it's no stretch to say that there existed a general lack of concern for those who suffered. The same goes for how the Roman government responded to times of plague and other catastrophic events. But Jesus turned this paradigm on its head, advocating for rigorous care of fellow human beings independent of the categories that so often condemned people in the ancient world, like class, gender, and religious beliefs. Jesus' teachings even led to the establishment of treatment centers for lepers, which in turn became the forerunners to hospitals. Through his teachings and examples that he set working among the needy, Jesus paved the way for charitable organizations. What's more, in his teachings, he demanded a new vision of society concerning the kingdom of God, which placed a premium on the value of human life and the celebration of fundamental civil rights.
Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
Toxic masculinity is a hot topic of conversation today, but it's safe to say that most contemporary men have nothing on those who lived thousands of years ago. Ancient Greeks, Romans, and Jews prized values like wisdom and courage. Humility fell nowhere in the mix. Men of the ancient world bragged about their accomplishments, whether the exploits of warriors or religious theatrics. Against this unbridled braggadocio, Jesus' exhortations to humility proved countercultural. As historian John Dixon has argued, it is unlikely that any of us would aspire to this virtue were it not for the historical impact of his crucifixion. Our culture remains cruciform long after it stopped being Christian. The lessons that Jesus taught his disciples and the world regarding how to treat others have had lasting repercussions. His name remains synonymous with forgiveness, so it's easy to forget that he preached to a society where forgiveness had no real utility. After all, the ancient world ran on the principles of rewarding friends and punishing enemies. This approach to life dominated everything. No wonder that political theorist Hannah Arendt wrote, "The discoverer of the role of forgiveness in the realm of human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth." While other examples of forgiveness existed before Jesus, it's safe to say he made the concept both famous and commonplace.
Go and sin no more.
Although many people associate Jesus exclusively with Christianity, he's also an important figure in Islam, along with his mother Mary and the angel Gabriel. Jesus is the son of the Virgin Mary, the only woman mentioned by name in the entire Quran. As for Jesus himself, he's a celebrated prophet who's mentioned 25 times in the Quran. For this reason, when his name is spoken, it's followed by the phrase, "Peace be upon him." In these stories, Jesus is portrayed as performing miracles and healings. What's more, the Quran prophesies that he will come back at the end of the world to defeat the Al-Musi ad-Dajjal, whom Christians know better as the Antichrist. Of course, these connections shouldn't minimize the fundamental differences between Christianity and Islam. After all, Muslims don't consider Jesus the Son of God, a distinction that shouldn't be ignored. Nevertheless, the importance of Jesus to the Quran shouldn't be underestimated either. As the Imam Dr. Umar Suleiman wrote in Religion News Service in 2020, "It's not an exaggeration to say that I could not be a Muslim without believing in Jesus. While we Muslims fundamentally differ with our Christian brethren on the Trinity, crucifixion, and salvation, our belief in Jesus is fundamental to our faith." Throughout history, there have been many examples of a phenomenon known as simultaneous invention, in which the same discovery is made by two separate people at just about the same time. For example, in the 1770s, Carl Wilhelm Scheele and Joseph Priestley both discovered oxygen, while in 1869, Louis Ducos d'Aron and Charles Cros shared their new practical methods for creating color photography on the exact same day. Such coincidences are certainly uncanny, but nothing quite compares to the claim of what might be considered simultaneous lives, especially when one of those lives was arguably one of the most significant in human history. Since the death of Jesus Christ, many theologians and thinkers have highlighted the numerous similarities between his life and that of a figure called Apollonius of Tyana. A follower of the works of Pythagoras, Apollonius is believed to have been alive at roughly the same time as Jesus. In addition, both built their own large and devoted followings during their lifetimes. Though Apollonius of Tyana was born in what is now Turkey, the parallels between his life and that of Jesus Christ are startling. Apollonius was a traveling teacher who attracted followers as a result of performing divine miracles such as healing, resurrection, and exorcism. Like Jesus, Apollonius was said to have supernaturally appeared to his followers after his death, who then became the champions of his teachings. The similarities in the lives of Jesus Christ and Apollonius of Tyana have even led to an unorthodox theory that the story of Jesus is based on the life of Apollonius. This, of course, would mean the entire Christian church was founded on the teachings of a pagan miracle worker. This theory gained traction in the early 1890s when Jonathan Manning Roberts published the tract Antiquity Unveiled, claiming Christianity was derived purely from Apollonius. Another theory posits that when the newly forming Christians had to decide which seemingly above-average guru was the Son of God, they simply chose Jesus over Apollonius. But Jesus of Nazareth and Apollonius of Tyana had very different beliefs regarding human relationships with God. Jesus taught that God answers prayers, but Apollonius told his followers that prayers and sacrifices were not what God wanted. Rather, he said God was pure intellect, and the way to communicate with him was via reason and meditation. In this sense, Apollonius' teachings were more similar to that of Hindus than what we know as Christianity today. Apollonius also spoke about reincarnation, the idea that the soul is continually reborn, and that the way you behave in one life determines how you will be reborn in the next. He also urged nonviolence, as did Jesus, but in addition to not hurting others, Apollonius encouraged his followers to avoid eating meat. According to him, this kind of pacifism could give you a leg up in your next life. Apollonius and Jesus both believed in living lives of simplicity, denouncing the wealthy and powerful. Yet Apollonius seems to have had stricter guidelines. Rather than turning water into wine, Apollonius condemned the consumption of alcohol.
If you hunger for righteousness, you will be filled through me.
Or, Apollonius. In fact, Apollonius is also considered an early scientist, and some argue that his miracles were more than just that. Instead, it is thought that they were specific tricks he knew how to pull because of his early scientific knowledge, which many people wouldn't have understood at the time. Jesus's and Apollonius's deaths weren't entirely similar either, in the sense that Jesus was put to death, while Apollonius appears to have died of old age. But nobody's really sure. Philostratus, who wrote down the story of Apollonius hundreds of years later, said of his passing, "Concerning the manner of his death, if he did die, the accounts are various." Indeed, the early biographers of Apollonius were vague about many of the details of his life and death. This means that proponents of the theories in question have tended to cherry-pick details so that his life more resembles that of Jesus. Moreover, many scholars and historians have levied criticism at the authenticity of some of the documents said to tell the story of his life, though we do at least have a handful of sources written by the man himself. The same certainly can't be said for Jesus.
You may be familiar with Judas Iscariot, but did you know some consider Mary Magdalene to be known as an adulteress? Keep your bread and wine ready, and stay tuned to find out more unknown facts about the events leading up to Jesus' death. Palm Sunday is the start of the Holy Week. Beside the term Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday is used as well. Jesus left Bethphage and traveled to Jerusalem as king, where he was greeted by people. He rode on a donkey as prophecies predicted. According to Christianity, the donkey signifies Jesus' gentleness and his down-to-earth nature. The crowd started to grow as many people wanted to follow Jesus on his journey. They started to place cloaks and plants on the road ahead of him. Palm branches were also used, a tradition which is still in place today. When Jesus caught a sight of Jerusalem, he started to weep. In the evening, Jesus journeyed to Bethany and met his friends and disciples.
He is Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth.
Can anything good come from Nazareth?
Come and see.
According to Time, celebrating Palm Sunday goes back to at least the late 4th century AD. The earliest documentation of Holy Week celebrations were written by Egeria, a nun who wrote a travel diary of her pilgrimage. Jesus returned to Jerusalem the next day and, on his way, spotted a fig tree. Being hungry, he searched for some fruit, but in vain. He cursed the fig tree. When they reached the temple, he spotted different people in the place of worship, though none of them were there for God. According to the learned religions, Jesus was appalled by the number of money changers and merchants who were making business at the temple. On the top of that, money changers were trading local currencies to Tyrian shekels, the only coins accepted for the temple tax, making a profit along the way. But high priests as well were profiting from all this trade, which opposed their role as spiritual leaders. This angered Jesus to the point where he ran around with a small whip, overturning tables and criticizing everyone involved. He drove everyone out of the temple. But by doing this, he created a conflict and more opposition with the authorities. As explained by Kenny Burchard, a Bible teacher, the anger Jesus displayed wasn't necessarily an act of violence, but a restorative and reparative action. He didn't use his whip to hurt any people or animals, but to create movement. With attack, he mirrored back the destructive forces that were, in his opinion, destroying the equilibrium of the world. According to Burchard, by that, Jesus forces out, cleanses, and aggressively removes that which impedes personhood, worship, relationship, and mission. After spending another night in Bethany, Jesus returned to Jerusalem. On his way, he noticed the fig tree he'd previously cursed, which had dried up. Arriving back to the temple, the Jewish religious leaders were angered with Jesus and his behavior as spiritual leader of the people. They tried to arrest him, but he eluded their ambush and called them hypocrites. Jesus continued his journey and visited the Mount of Olives. According to Britannica, the peak can be found east of the Old City of Jerusalem and it's 2,694 feet high. The place is inhabited by a combined mosque and Christian chapel, while sacred Jewish burial grounds cover the mountain slopes.
You are the light of the world, and let your light so shine before men.
On the Mount of Olives, Jesus shared one of his famous prophecies, speaking about the downfall of Jerusalem. He also spoke of the epic, which will bring natural disasters, even stars falling from the sky. Just recently in 2020, a Jewish ritual bath was unearthed at the foot of Mount of Olives, dating back to around 2,000 years ago, which corresponds with the time of Jesus' life. Although many ritual baths were found across ancient Jerusalem, this was the first archaeological evidence found from that exact period. According to Father Francesco Patton, the latest excavations conducted on this site have confirmed the antiquity of the Christian memory and tradition linked to the place. And this is very important for us and for the spiritual meaning connected with the archaeological findings. Not much is written in the scriptures about this day. The day prior to the Last Supper, also known as Passover, could be spent by preparing everything necessary for the event. But many believe this is the day on which Judas Iscariot plotted his betrayal of Jesus Christ. In remembrance of this event, the day is sometimes called Spy Wednesday. According to Hope Bollinger, this event is mentioned in the Old Testament, the text written hundreds of years before as well. In that scripture, Zechariah predicts the exact amount of money for which Judas would sell Jesus out, 30 pieces of silver. I told them, so they paid me 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. This resonates with the later events in the New Testament, where Judas donated the money he got for betraying Jesus. However, the priests use it to buy a potter's field. On Thursday, Jesus organized a Passover meal for 12 of his closest disciples. As explained by Mary Fairchild for Learn Religions, the Passover feast is an important part of Jewish tradition. An 8-day celebration is prepared in memory of Israel's emancipation from Egyptian slavery and the freedom of the Jewish people. During the dinner, Jesus explained to his devotees that this would be his last meal. Jesus shared bread and wine with everyone, describing how bread stands for his body and wine for his blood. This event is the foundation for the communion ritual, the Eucharist, an important part of different church practices, which include drinking sacramental wine and eating sacramental bread, the host. After the meal, Jesus washed the feet of all of his disciples and told them they should do the same.
No slaves are greater than their master, and no messengers are greater than the one who sent them.
The chief priest and the elders had already decided they wanted to see Jesus dead, but they agreed to wait until Passover festivities were over. According to Christianity, during the Passover dinner, Jesus predicted that one of the disciples, the one that will be given the piece of bread, will betray him. He gave bread to Judas Iscariot, and at that moment, Satan entered Judas, and Judas left the dinner. He went to the chief priest, who wanted to see Jesus dead, and asked him, how much is he willing to pay? Later, while Jesus was praying in the garden, Judas entered with the guard, after he got the promised 30 pieces of silver from the chief priest in return. To show the guards which man is Jesus, Judas identified him with a kiss. As Herschel Shanks, biblical archaeology expert, summarizes in his review of the latest translation of an 8th century Gnostic gospel, the kiss had to happen because of Jesus' shape-shifting abilities. 3 out of 4 canonical gospels describe how Jesus' appearance can vary in size, color of the skin, age. He can even become bodiless. The idea of Jesus as a shapeshifter was first mentioned in Contra Celsum, written by Origen, a theologian who lived AD 185 to 254. He claimed that, to those who saw him, Jesus, he did not appear alike to all. Next morning, Judas realized what he had done and felt guilty. He returned the 30 silver coins, threw them into the temple, and hanged himself. For several hours, Jesus tried to defend himself before the Jewish high priest Caiaphas and the Jewish political tribunal of elders, Sanhedrin, but the verdict is clear: he is guilty of blasphemy. Another trial followed, before the religious Sanhedrin this time, but the verdict is the same. He is accused of blasphemy once again. But, by law, the order for execution could only come from the Roman government, so they sent Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea, and accused him of the attempt to undermine the Roman government.
Do you think I'm a Jew? It was your own people and the chief priests who handed you over to me.
Pilate did not find any evidence, sent Jesus to Herod Antipas. The story repeated, and Jesus was back with Pilate. Pilate gave in and ordered the execution. Since Jesus traveled by foot from Palestine, it is reasonable to assume he was in good health before the trial started, but his health deteriorated rapidly during the 12 hours of legal proceedings. As explained further by Edwards, Gable, and Hosmer, Jesus was deeply affected by the 6 trials, suffering from great emotional stress, as evidenced by hematidrosis, blood sweat, abandonment by his closest friends, the disciples, and a physical beating after the first Jewish trial. As if the execution punishment wasn't enough, the soldiers continued to mock Jesus. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. The journey to the execution place was long and exhausting. Weakened from torture, the accused had to carry a cross from the flogging site to the site of crucifixion outside of the city. The cross Jesus had to carry was the middle part, crossbar, which weighed around 75 to 125 pounds. Accompanied by a Roman guard, naked and depleted, Jesus slowly continued his journey, supported by his loved ones from afar. There is still a debate where the exact place of the crucifixion, Golgotha, was located. But according to Joan E. Taylor, professor and writer, the site was an oval-shaped, disused quarry located west of the second wall of Jerusalem, north of the first wall. The ancient crucifixion and pre-crucifixion practices were intended to cause intense agony, and each phase could cause death on its own. Since the rules dictated that every execution should start with flogging, Jesus was severely beaten before crucifixion. This not only weakened him, but subjected him to severe blood loss and circulatory shock. The actual cause of death of Jesus could be hypovolemic shock, heart failure, cardiorespiratory failure, or something else. Luke chapter 23, verse 44 to verse 46 reads, "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' When he had said this, he breathed his last." The exact time of Jesus' death is still debated. Some interpretations claim that the crucifixion took place earlier, so the exact time of death should be on Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. This way, Jewish law, which stated that a person is legally dead only after 3 days, would be fulfilled. This goes along with the prophecies, which saw Jesus resurrected after 3 nights and days. Nevertheless, the general view of the matter, as well as contemporary celebrations, count Good Friday as the day of Jesus' crucifixion and death. After Jesus' death, his body was put in a tomb and sealed. The guards were worried that Jesus' disciples would steal his body and tell the people he had risen from the dead. Jesus' devotees and close ones held a 40-hour-long vigil outside of the tomb, waiting for his resurrection. Most people refrained from activity that day because it was Sabbath, the day of rest. In the evening, Mary Magdalene, Mary, James's mother, and Salome went and bought some burial spices to anoint Jesus' body. According to Jesus of Nazareth, an independent historian's account of his life and teaching, they were there for the whole process of Jesus' crucifixion and death. While his male disciples fled, the women are the only members of the group who stuck by Jesus' side, even if only from afar. According to the Gospels, Mary Magdalene was Jesus' closest disciple. As per Berger A. Pearson, professor of religious studies, numerous theologians and priests intentionally downplayed the role of Mary Magdalene throughout history, turning her into a sinful woman, a sex worker. Although there is not a single place in the scripts that would mention her as such, Pope Gregory the Great identified her as the unknown adulteress mentioned in John's Gospel, and since then that story was told as the truth. The idea of Mary Magdalene as a sex worker is specific only to the Western Church interpretations. Early in the morning, Mary Magdalene visited the tomb and noticed that the stone was removed from the entrance. She called to other disciples, and together they entered the tomb. They saw the linen in which Jesus' body was wrapped, but no body. While Mary Magdalene was crying, she saw two angels and a figure of a man. The man turned out to be Jesus, who told her not to touch him, since he had not ascended yet. According to the Jesus Family Tomb Examined, did Jesus rise physically? Despite numerous theories and perspectives on Jesus' resurrection, the evidence demonstrated that the Bible can be trusted as a historical document, and therefore it gives credence to the resurrection accounts of Jesus of Nazareth.
Stop your doubting and believe.
My Lord and my God.
The event is described in many different sources, such as in the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures from a Second Temple period, Jewish literature written in the period from 200 BC to 200 AD, and rabbinic literature. Lopez concludes the fact that people would rise bodily from the dead was the predominant view and background of the period when the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection recorded the New Testament. A reading of the evidence makes this point indisputable.
One of the most important figures in human history is Jesus Christ, or if you prefer, Jesus of Nazareth. This iconic religious figure, who serves as the focal point for the 2.3 billion followers of the religion that bears his name, has been celebrated in art, music, literature, and prayer in the 2,000 years since he lived and died. However, for most of those 2,000 years, just about everybody who has said his name has pronounced it wrong. This is because Jesus did not speak modern English, nor did he speak any language spoken by all but a handful of people today. His everyday language would have been Aramaic, a cousin of the Hebrew language, and his name was an ancient Aramaic name. What's more, the name he is known by today was not transliterated directly from the ancient language into modern language. Rather, there was an intermediary language that muddled the picture even further. When you are saying Jesus' name in modern English, what you are saying is actually the English approximation of the ancient Greek transliteration of an Aramaic name, since the New Testament was written in Greek. Therefore, it looks and sounds different from what his mother would have named him. Similarly, when you say Jesus in Spanish, or Asu in Japanese, or however his name is rendered into any modern language, you are saying the local version of the ancient Greek version of the Aramaic name. The first century prophet likely went by the name Yeshua, which was short for Yehoshua. This means something akin to God is salvation, and if it looks somewhat familiar, that's because another Bible character had the same name, the Old Testament's Joshua. However, the New Testament was written in ancient Greek, which rendered Jesus' name as Iesos, which wound up in English as Jesus. While a more direct translation of Yeshua in English would be Joshua, the writers of the New Testament deliberately tried to make the Hebrew and Aramaic name work in Greek, leading to the evolution of the name. Basically, those writers wanted to write Yeshua's name using Greek letters, but they didn't have a representation for the SH sound. Instead, they substituted an S, leading to the name Iesos. 16th century translations of the Bible subsequently changed the I at the beginning of the name and replaced it with a J, and eventually his name was spelled Jesus. There's no real explanation for exactly why this replacement happened, other than to say it had largely to do with transliteration, or changing sounds and letters from one alphabet to a separate alphabet, like a square peg in a round hole. The name Jesus today is synonymous with the Christian belief that a man by that name was the Son of God. Jesus is a well-known name, of course, one that requires no introduction to most people living in the world thousands of years after the historical figure died, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof. But in Yeshua's era, his name was actually pretty common. Back in Jesus' day, people with the same name were distinguished by who their father was, so young Yeshua's surname would not be a family name in the same way such names are passed down today. Rather, he would have been known as the son of Joseph, or Yeshua bar Yehoseph. Another way they would have distinguished one Yeshua from another is by adding the place they were from onto the end of their names. This would make him Yeshua Nazariah, which in modern English translates to Jesus of Nazareth.
I'm Brian of Nazareth. What? Yeah, I'm Brian of Nazareth. Take him down. I'm Brian of Nazareth. I'm Brian. I'm Brian.
The word Christ was never part of Yeshua's name either. It means anointed one and is a title conferred upon him later. Amidst the backdrop of all this is the question of whether calling Jesus something that sounds only vaguely like his actual name is disrespectful or even sinful. Indeed, some Christians vehemently believe that he should be referred to by his original name. However, Christendom has largely rejected that view, arguing that one's salvation is in no way tied to how Jesus' name is pronounced. Jesus or Yeshua, it's all good.
Good Samaritan, prodigal son, good shepherd, even the word talent. These are words and phrases you'd never have heard without the parables of Jesus. Whether or not you're a believer in Christianity, it's clear that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth have had a tremendous impact on the world, right down to the words we use. In a piece for The Guardian, data analysts Stephen Skeena and Charles B. Ward claim that Jesus objectively holds the title of most significant figure in history, and it's hard to argue otherwise. Aside from his apparent resurrection, the Jesus of the Bible was known for two things: performing miracles and teaching in parables. The miracles are a given. After all, if you're going to claim to be the Son of God, you'd better have some cool tricks to back it up. But what were the parables for? Jesus often refused to just say what he meant. Instead, he turned his teachings into allegorical stories that illustrated his spiritual and moral ideas. So what gives? Well, for starters, Jesus didn't invent the parable. Both the ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew worlds have clear examples of them, and the Old Testament has quite a few of its own. Still, Jesus did for parables what Shakespeare did for sonnets. And while parables exist in other religious and philosophical traditions, those told by Jesus have entered a class of their own.
And the seeds that fell in good soil stand for those who hear the message and retain it in a good and obedient heart, and they persist until they bear fruit.
Indeed, people have been telling short stories with lessons about as long as they've been able to talk. Early examples can be found in Aesop fables, such as The Ant and the Grasshopper. Fables do tend to differ from parables, in the sense that fables involve talking animals or objects, while parables tend to be more realistic. But they're clearly related. The collision of the classical and Jewish world served as the context of Jesus' ministry, and both of these traditions have a history of using parables. On the pagan side, the Greek philosopher Prodicus famously told the story of Hercules at the crossroads, in which the mythological hero meets personifications of vice and virtue, and is asked to choose between an easy life and a noble life. The Old Testament also has its share of parables and fables. For instance, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, the prophet Nathan rebukes David for his assault of Bathsheba and the killing of her husband Uriah. To do so, he tells a story about a rich man who steals and slaughters a poor man's only lamb. Meanwhile, Judges chapter 9 includes a memorable fable about the trees looking to crown a king. The lesson is that the only individual who could want to be a king, represented here by a thorn bush, is probably going to be someone with nothing else valuable to offer. So why parables? The most obvious explanation is that Jesus' audience would have been familiar with them, since they had existed long before Jesus did. It might also have helped him keep people's attention. After all, it's easier to sell people a story than it is to sell them a theological or moral lesson. On the other hand, it's possible that Jesus' primary motivation in telling parables was to conceal his meaning from the authorities. If he was threatened with arrest for heresy or insurrection, he would be able to point out that he was simply telling stories. Of course, it's also worth remembering that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus clearly tells his disciples why he teaches the way he does. He says, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." So according to Jesus, he taught in parables to make sure only the right people understood him. Given that, it's a little weird that so many of them have become so iconic. But then again, no one really understands Moby Dick either.
Moses on a UFO, Jesus as a goblin, and an ear with its own gravesite. You didn't hear about these historical events in the Bible. The world is full of accounts from the life of Jesus Christ, from the 4 canonical Gospels of the New Testament to a host of texts from late antiquity and the medieval period. Among these numerous takes, there are certain details that generally tend to remain constant, like the idea that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, or that his ministry was in Judea, or that he was crucified. There is one set of documents, however, that suggests these texts got the life of Jesus and everything about the entire history of the universe all wrong. The Take no Uchi manuscripts are a set of documents whose adherents claim were translated 1,500 years ago in a mixture of modern Japanese and Chinese characters. They're said to have been created by a man named Take no Uchino Matori, who, as legend has it, transliterated a set of even older texts that were written by the gods and divine characters. The text of the manuscripts themselves claims to tell the secret history of humankind, from creation until the beginning of the Christian era. But what's the real story? Although the life of Jesus as related in the Take no Uchi manuscripts may be of interest to English speakers, there's a lot more to these texts. The cosmic history laid out in the document says that the world was originally nothing but a great expanse of mud, coalescing slowly over the course of 22 billion years. Eventually, the gods and goddesses emerged. They separated the earth from the sky and formed the sun and the moon. Pretty standard creation story stuff as far as all that goes. Over the course of multiple generations, the gods evolved and created things like writing and agriculture. Billions of years later, they dispersed across the various nations and created humans, which were divided into 5 colors: white, red, blue, yellow, and black. In this history, Japan was made the center of the universe. The world was ultimately united under a single government by the god emperor Sumera Mikoto, who divided the globe into 16 districts, like the petals of a chrysanthemum flower. Along the way, Sumera Mikoto, who would tour the land in a flying ship, built the pyramids in Egypt as a way to communicate with the gods. Eventually, humans began to disobey the gods, who retaliated by sinking 2 continents in the Pacific Ocean. The documents claim that many such catastrophes have occurred across history due to the arrogance of humankind. The Take no Uchi documents also tell a history of the masters born from each of the colors of humankind, which the manuscripts name as Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Shakyamuni, Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu. The life story of Jesus told within these documents differs pretty substantially from what you might have learned in Sunday school. While the New Testament says that Jesus grew up in Nazareth and began his ministry at about the age of 30, the Take no Uchi documents say he left Judea for Japan at the age of 21, where he studied for 12 years before returning to Judea at age 33 to begin his ministry. Much like in the Bible, Jesus received resistance from the people for his teachings and found himself in trouble with the Roman authorities. Unlike Bible Jesus, however, Take no Uchi Jesus had a brother, Isukiri, who volunteered to pose as Jesus and take his place on the cross. In this version, it was actually Jesus' brother who was crucified, while the real Jesus returned to Japan. From there, he married, had 3 daughters, and lived as a simple rice farmer until the age of 106. During this period, Jesus spent his time in Shingo, helping those in need. Over the years, he developed a balding head with gray hair and an appearance that compelled the local villagers to compare him to a goblin. Really? For some time now, the village of Shingo has advertised itself as the true final resting place of Jesus Christ. The Japanese tomb of Jesus is a burial mound on top of a hill that's decorated with a cross and a small fence. Nearby is another smaller mound, which is said to hold a lock of hair from the Virgin Mary and one of the ears of Isukiri. Much of this is explained in the nearby Jesus Museum that contains replicas of the Take no Uchi documents themselves. In addition to the manuscripts and the burial mounds, some residents of Shingo say that they are descended from Jesus himself as proof of his residence. They also underline that the people of Shingo have different dialects and eye colors from surrounding villages, citing this as proof of Christian blood. Jesus isn't the only figure in the Take no Uchi manuscripts. The documents also say that following the revelation of the 10 Commandments to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, Moses boarded a spaceship and flew to Japan. Once he arrived there, he delivered a set of 10 additional commandments, many of which appear to contradict the earlier ones.
13th commandment, this is a great one. 13th commandment says, when you use Q-tips, just go around the outside of the ears.
These new commandments included worshiping the Japanese gods, worshiping the emperor, protecting the laws of the 5 races, and worshiping the spirit kami. This is a lot of worshiping entities that are not the God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt. Smithsonian Magazine observes that this version of Moses had received the original commandments, as well as the Hebrew language and the Star of David, from the God Emperor of Japan. Moses lived to the ripe old age of 583, nearly 6 times the lifespan of Jesus. He was buried in Japan's Ishikawa Prefecture, with the burial mounds of his family located nearby. The Take no Uchi manuscripts are obviously extremely interesting as an alien-filled secret history of the world. But the question of how reliable or authentic they are depends on who you ask. As Ancient Origins explains, the official claim of the foundation behind the documents is that they are authentic and were subsequently preserved by the descendants of the Take no Uchi family over generations. According to Slate, the official narrative goes on to say that the documents were eventually discovered in the 1930s by a group of Japanese archaeologists, only to be destroyed during World War II. Fortunately, replicas like the ones in the museum in Shingo were created first. Atlas Obscura explains, however, that it is extremely likely that the documents were a hoax created by a man named Wado Kosaka, a self-described cosmo-archaeologist who was born in 1947. Wado also gained a certain amount of notoriety by trying to make contact with a UFO on live television. He died in 2002 at the age of 54, after which control of the Association for the Study of the Take no Uchi documents was passed on to his wife, Michio Miwa. The Holy Lance ranks among the greatest of Christianity's relics, right up there with the True Cross and the Shroud of Turin. But which Holy Lance is the real Spear of Destiny? In canonical Christian scripture, the Holy Lance appears only in the Gospel of John. In this account, Jesus was crucified side by side with 2 thieves. Afterward, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate sent soldiers to break their legs with iron clubs, a practice known as crurifragum. By doing so, the condemned person would no longer be able to support their weight on the cross, which would hasten their death. Pilate ordered it so that the bodies could be taken down before the Sabbath. When the soldiers arrived, they broke the legs of the two thieves, but found that Jesus was already dead. To make sure, the Gospel of John relates, one soldier thrust his lance into his side, and immediately blood and water flowed out.
Surely this man was innocent.
Biblical analyses often point to the presence of water with the blood as miraculous and representative of baptism and sacrifice. Other interpretations suggest the water was likely bodily fluids that had built up in the sacs surrounding Christ's heart and lungs, released when the spear pierced his side. There's no other mention of the Roman soldier's lance in Christian canon, and it's unclear what happened to the weapon afterward. More information about the Holy Lance, or at least the wielder of it, comes from the apocryphal work The Gospel of Nicodemus, written in the 4th or 5th century. The author identifies the wielder of the spear as a Roman centurion named Longinus, and some Christian traditions hold that Longinus was the same centurion from the Gospel of Mark who, after Jesus' death, exclaimed,
"Truly this man was the Son of God."
In some narratives, Longinus was blind or had another malady such as ophthalmia, which was miraculously cured when his eyes were touched by blood from the wound he'd made in Jesus' side. Thus, the spear was now the Holy Lance, and Longinus was changed. Some Christian traditions maintain that Longinus gave up his life as a soldier, converted to Christianity, and was beheaded. He became Saint Longinus, with a feast day held on October 16th. It's inevitable that a holy relic used to pierce the body of one of the most famous religious figures in history would be credited with supernatural powers. According to legend, both Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa were consistently victorious when they wielded the lance. It's for this alleged ability to guarantee victory for good or evil that the Holy Lance is also called the Spear of Destiny. Most of the legends say that when a person loses the lance, death follows. Both Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa supposedly died shortly after dropping or losing the lance. Another power ascribed to the Holy Lance is healing. This figures most prominently in lore around the Holy Grail, the cup used to catch the blood of Jesus at the Crucifixion. In these stories, the Grail and the lance are paired. In Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century compendium of tales of King Arthur, La Morte d'Arthur, he explains how, in Arthurian legend, the lance came to symbolize the earth's life force. In one tale, Sir Balin wounds the keeper of the Grail and spear, known as the Fisher King. The unholy act causes the land to waste away, righted only when the Fisher King is healed by the Holy Lance. The history of the Holy Lance is made up of religious texts, scraps of evidence, and folklore. One tradition claims that Joseph of Arimathea, who was in charge of Jesus' burial, obtained the Holy Lance and the Holy Grail. From that point, the Holy Lance seems to vanish until about AD 570, when a writing attributed to someone known as the Piacenza Pilgrim claims that he saw the lance in the Basilica of Zion while on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. After this, the history of the Holy Lance becomes even cloudier. Around AD 615, Jerusalem was captured by the Persians, and somewhere in the confusion, the point of the lance was broken off and taken to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, where it was incorporated into an icon. The second part of the lance is mentioned by the historian Arcopa, who saw it sometime around AD 670 after the Byzantine Empire had retaken Jerusalem. From there, the lance drops out of the historical record again, and the original two pieces multiply into several artifacts that have since been presented as the true Holy Lance. One of the most dramatic stories of Holy Lance lore is that of French pilgrim Peter Bartholomew. During the First Crusade, he claimed to have visions of St. Andrew, who revealed to him the location of the lance. He recounted his visions to crusade leaders, but a papal representative was skeptical. However, regiment leader Count Raymond of Toulouse wasn't. His willingness to believe Bartholomew may be understandable. According to an account written by a priest who participated in the First Crusade, Christian forces were besieged at Antioch, and spirits had reached a low point. There were military setbacks, and the troops staved off hunger by eating leaves, grapevines, and dried animal skins. Bartholomew insisted the Holy Lance was buried in the floor of Antioch's cathedral. Workers spent a day digging but produced nothing. Finally, Bartholomew jumped into the hole and dug up a rusty iron rod. While the Crusade's commanders were dubious, it nevertheless produced the morale boost needed to break the siege, despite being far outnumbered by their enemies.
It was an extraordinary achievement, and only the passion and enthusiasm of religious fervor helps us, I think, adequately to understand it.
After their victory, many crusaders began looking to Peter as a spiritual leader. Even so, the ensuing frequency of Bartholomew's supposed visions strained credibility. To prove he'd found the true Holy Lance, Bartholomew submitted to an ordeal of fire in which two pyres were lit with a small space between them. If Bartholomew was telling the truth, he would survive walking through the fires with the lance, but Peter Bartholomew sustained severe burns and died. It's believed that at some point the Holy Lance was split into two relics, the tip and the much larger shaft. According to a 7th century Byzantine text known as a Chronicon Paschale, the tip was brought to Constantinople, where it was set within an icon. Fast forward a few centuries to the Fourth Crusade, when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople and established their own Latin Empire. This empire lasted until 1261, when Emperor Baldwin II was ousted by the Byzantines. But before that, Baldwin got his hands on the spear's tip. He sold it to King Louis IX of France. The French king, who was sainted after death for his piety, placed the relic at the Church of Sainte-Chapelle. It remained there until the French Revolution, when it was moved to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris because of the civic tumult. Sadly, the tip vanished sometime after the move. Its whereabouts are unknown to this day. One piece of the spear can be traced fairly easily. In 1357, Sir John Mandeville wrote that he saw objects described as the blade of the Holy Lance in both Paris and Constantinople, with the one in Constantinople being the larger of the two. The Constantinople relic then came into possession of the Ottoman Empire after it conquered Constantinople in 1453. However, the Ottoman Turks didn't hold on to the object long. In 1492, the Sultan Bayezid II sent the relic to Rome as part of a diplomatic entreaty with Pope Innocent VIII, who was holding the Sultan's brother prisoner. This object is now held under the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, but the Catholic Church doesn't claim it to be the authentic Holy Lance, partly because of conflicting claims of other Holy Lances. To further complicate matters, it's unclear if the item found by Peter Bartholomew in Antioch is the one now held in the Vatican or another relic that was also held in Constantinople. However, in the 18th century, Pope Benedict XIV had an exact drawing made of the Paris relic, compared it to the one in St. Peter's, and became convinced the two pieces had come from the same object. He declared the Antioch lance of Peter Bartholomew a fake, even though there are lingering questions as to whether the one in the Catholic Church's possession is the same artifact. The next contender for the true Holy Lance can be found in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, Austria. Legend connects this Holy Lance to the Emperor Constantine, who supposedly commissioned the piece after his mother found 3 nails believed to be relics from the Crucifixion. The emperor supposedly took 2 to incorporate into his crown and horse bridle. The third was incorporated into the lance. Alternative lore claims that this lance belonged to Saint Maurice, a leader of the Theban Legion who was martyred after he refused to kill Christians. In any event, this lance is described in Stephen Klimchuk's Secret Places Hidden Sanctuaries as a piece of metal with a purported nail of the crucifixion held to it by gold, silver, and copper thread. Despite the murky history, this spear became closely associated with the power and prestige of monarchy. It's believed it ended up in the possession of Charlemagne and the subsequent Holy Roman Emperors, eventually finding its way to Nuremberg. When leadership of the Holy Roman Empire passed to monarchs in Austria, the relic was relocated to Vienna. To those who believe, the Holy Lance is an artifact of great power. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that history's dictator of dictators, Adolf Hitler, was interested in the spear. Trevor Ravenscroft, author of the controversial 1972 book The Spear of Destiny, wrote that the talisman of power was to become the central pivot in the life of Adolf Hitler and the very source of his ambitions to conquer the world.
And there's this very powerful sense that the lance is absolutely fundamental to Hitler's yearning for power.
After Hitler came to power and annexed Austria in 1938, he confiscated the treasures of the Habsburg dynasty, including the spear. The relic was sent to Nuremberg, where it was kept at St. Catherine's Church. Hitler went on to wage the deadliest war in world history, but on April 30th, 1945, he died by suicide. Legend has it that a few hours before, American soldiers had captured the Spear of Destiny, supposedly depriving Hitler of its powers. The story has been completely debunked. In reality, US troops took possession in 1946, months after Hitler's death. Regrettably, Ravenscroft's fake spear story is still being spread by numerous media outlets. The next candidate for the title of the real Holy Lance can be found in Armenia. According to lore, St. Thaddeus, or even Longinus himself, brought the spear to Armenia during the 1st century. Sources from late antiquity concur that the relic was indeed there, but confusion abounds since there was already a multiplicity of lances. The lance found a home in the monastery of Gagard, which means spear in Armenian, where a reliquary was built for it in 1268. Like its brethren, this lance was also believed to have magic powers. For example, the Armenian Church relates how in 1798, the lance was lent to the King of Georgia to heal those afflicted by a plague. This lance, however, is shaped a bit differently than a spear. It's more diamond-shaped, and the tip isn't sharp, leading some to question the authenticity of the relic. Today, this Holy Lance may be found in Bagharshapat in Armenia. The Holy Lance, with its convoluted history, rumored magical powers, and enduring mystery, continues to be a source of fascination. While it's not as ubiquitous as the Ark of the Covenant, it has a major presence in popular culture. For example, the 2005 Keanu Reeves film Constantine features the Spear of Destiny, which was found by a scavenger in the ruins of a church wrapped in a Nazi flag. Even Indiana Jones made a foray to find the lance before the Nazis in a graphic novel titled Indiana Jones and the Spear of Destiny. And Nazis also feature prominently in the classic computer game Wolfenstein 3D Spear of Destiny, in which the player has to get the spear from the bad guys. With the Holy Lance inspiring so much public fascination for nearly 2 millennia at this point, it's safe to say that the legend of the Spear of Destiny and all its incarnations will continue to be a source of enduring mystery and conspiracy theories for a long time to come. A tomb in Israel contains a stunning story that has endured for thousands of years. This is the fascinating, perhaps unbelievable, history of the final resting place of Jesus' midwife. The narrative of the nativity of Jesus only appears in the Gospel of Luke, which simply says that Jesus was born, wrapped in cloth, and laid in a manger. The only people mentioned who are present besides Mary and Joseph are the shepherds and angels. That certainly does not include any midwife to aid in the delivery. Before the Protestant Reformation asserted that the only writings bearing divine authority are the books of Scripture, many Christians' understanding of major biblical figures came from traditions beyond the Bible. One of the most influential of the sources is a book called The Infancy Gospel of James. It offers an expanded account of the birth and childhood of Mary, as well as a nativity, including a scene where Joseph goes looking for a midwife and time stands still. He returns to the cave where he left Mary, only to see the area become filled with a blinding light and the baby Jesus teleport from Mary's womb and into her arms. No midwife needed. You might think that the midwife that Joseph found is the one whose tomb was found, but there's a bit more to this story.
Who is Salome?
The Infancy Gospel of James also notes that the unnamed midwife that Joseph fetched is amazed at the miracle. She then goes to tell another midwife named Salome all about this incredible teleporting baby, but Salome refuses to believe that her friend has seen a virgin birth until she can examine Mary's undercarriage for herself. When she reaches under Mary's dress, her hand burns and withers as punishment for her lack of faith. Salome then prays to God for forgiveness. God then sends an angel who tells her to touch the baby Jesus in his manger crib, and she will be healed. The gospel continues, but this is essentially the end of Salome's story. These two midwives are commonly depicted in art bathing or otherwise tending to the infant Jesus. Although some other texts and traditions apply various names to the first midwife, Salome is the one who has a consistent name throughout the tradition. Weirdly enough, though, there's actually not that much difference between being named Salome and having no name at all. As it turns out, Salome was an incredibly popular moniker among Jewish women in the 1st century CE. It's derived from the well-known Hebrew word shalom, meaning peace. There were a number of notable Jewish women from this time period with the name Salome, and even the midwife isn't the only one tied to the life of Jesus. Perhaps the most famous Salome is the daughter of Herodias, who demanded John the Baptist's head on a platter, although she never actually is named in the Bible. But the Gospels do talk about a Salome who was at the crucifixion and one who was at the empty tomb, as well as one who was the mother of the apostles James and John, who might have been Mary's sister. It's unclear how many of these Salomes are distinct people, as various traditions combine them in different ways. Some churches even teach that Salome the midwife is the same as the one from the empty tomb, thereby making her one of the first to witness both Jesus' birth and resurrection. The actual physical tomb that's traditionally been identified as that of Salome can be found in a cave near Tel Lachish National Park, about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's near the ancient city of Lachish, which appears several times throughout the Hebrew Bible. The tomb of Salome is part of a larger burial complex. Within the cave, there are various burial niches carved out of the rock walls, as well as numerous ossuaries, which are essentially receptacles or vaults full of loose bones in various states of disrepair. It's likely that it was in one of these ossuaries that medieval Christians found the name Salome written and thus identify the cave as the burial place of Jesus' midwife. The site then became a place of pilgrimage for Christians starting around the 5th century CE.
Even today, Christian pilgrims still visit this cave.
Before becoming a destination for traveling Christians, the tomb of Salome was almost certainly originally just a burial complex for a wealthy Jewish family from the late Second Temple period. That means that it was probably roughly contemporary with the life of Jesus. Evidence for this includes the style of the burial itself, which reflects the Jewish customs of the time. Furthermore, in addition to the numerous niches and ossuaries, there's a forecourt spanning nearly 4,000 square feet covered with mosaic flooring. Additionally, the entrance to the cave was lavishly decorated with various carvings that would have been symbolically significant to Jewish mourners. Pomegranates, rosettes, and vases decorated with acanthus leaves. All of these are fairly typical of Jewish design at the time. One important signifier of the wealth of the family is the fact that similar tombs of the time would have had their forecourts simply carved out of the rock and not filled with elaborate masonry and tiling as the Salome cave does. While the figure of Salome the Midwife is not very familiar to modern Christians, she was well known to early followers who weren't as concerned with modern ideas like whether or not the infancy Gospel of James was biblical canon. Typical depictions of Salome and the other midwife and Orthodox versions of the Nativity indicate that the women were well regarded in the Eastern Church. One clear sign of Salome's popularity is the use of her alleged tomb as a pilgrimage site for Christians in the early Middle Ages. Archaeological evidence suggests that the pilgrimage site was a fairly popular one into the early Muslim period, continuing as a shrine until at least the 9th century. Recent excavations have uncovered clay oil lamps that date to the 8th and 9th centuries. They would have been used by pilgrims either to light their way in the dark burial niches or as part of their veneration of the shrine, similar to the lighting of candles at someone's grave. Archaeologists have even uncovered a row of shop stalls surrounding the complex's forecourt where merchants would have rented or sold these lamps to pilgrims for this purpose. The idea that the veneration of Salome at her tomb continued into the Muslim era is supported by the fact that the cave's interior walls were covered in inscriptions and engravings by visitors across the centuries. Some of these dozens of carvings are written in Greek and clearly from Christian pilgrims, while others are written in Syriac and Arabic. But after the 9th century, there is very little known about what happened to the cave. Presumably, it fell into disuse as a shrine, as the Crusades would have made pilgrimages more difficult. The tomb was essentially forgotten until 1982, when looters searching for antiquities broke into the tomb-turned-shrine. These grave robbers drew the attention of legitimate archaeologists, including Professor Amos Kloner of Israel's Antiquities Department, who began a series of excavations that have continued to this day.
We knew about the cave at least for 40 years. Everything was buried down.
Kloner's excavation revealed the burial niches and ossuaries, but the thing that surprised him was the presence of Christian crosses in a Jewish tomb, as well as the architectural conversion of the place into a chapel or shrine. Though the ossuary that probably inspired the veneration of the site was gone, the inscriptions on the walls indicated that this was likely the shrine of the midwife Salome. In more recent years, archaeologists have begun to uncover the spacious forecourt to the burial complex. These excavations by the Israel Antiquities Authority are part of a plan to open up the site to the public, as part of a larger project emphasizing Jewish cultural heritage throughout the Judean lowlands. The entrance courtyard encompasses about 350 square meters, or roughly 3,767 square feet. This is the area that's tiled with mosaic flooring and surrounded by walls made from ashlar stone masonry. This style of masonry is made from finely hewn stone formed into smooth and irregularly shaped rectangular bricks that fit together tightly. These unusually nice elements contribute to the idea that this cave was originally the resting place for a particularly wealthy family, as well as a popular chapel and shrine. This is the area that also includes much of the intricate carving and design work and the numerous impromptu engravings made by pilgrims and other visitors that helped identify the site as Salome's. In addition to the courtyard's mosaic flooring and elaborate walls, the entrance to the cave also features tall arches and the market stalls where the dozens of clay lamps were found. These lamps are elaborately ornamented with common artistic motifs such as pomegranates and more geometric elements. Perhaps even more interesting is the abundant graffiti found throughout the cave. In addition to the numerous crosses that help identify the cave as a Christian site, numerous pilgrims carved their own names into the wall. But most critically, the name Salome and the word midwife appear over and over. Perhaps the most notable inscription reads, Zachariah ben Carolus, dedicated to the Holy Salome. The archaeologists of the Israel Antiquities Authority have suggested that Zachariah ben Carolus was a Jewish patron of the site and may have used his own personal wealth in the development of the shrine and courtyard. More surprising discoveries include modern-day candles, icons, and other elements of worship, which indicate that the shrine is still being visited by pilgrims, even if it's technically illegal until the site is open to the public.
The Israel Antiquities Authority hopes to complete the excavations in coming months and open it up to the public soon.
As of 2023, the site of the Salome Cave is still being excavated and remains closed to public exploration. But a major reason for this new dig is to prepare the site to become a place where general audiences can come and enjoy it. The restoration is part of a larger project by the Israel Antiquities Authority, the Ministry for Jerusalem and Heritage, and the Jewish National Fund called the Judean King's Trail Project. This 60-mile trail crosses through the Judean lowlands and covers numerous sites that were significant in the times of the Bible, the Second Temple period, or the development of the Talmud. The Israel Antiquities Authority is certain that there will be an interest in the Salome Cave as a sacred Christian site. Their current efforts include seeking out ways to protect the numerous inscriptions carved into the walls while making them accessible to tourists. They likewise hope that once the site is officially open, modern-day pilgrims will no longer feel it necessary to break in, and everyone who wants to will be able to visit safely. While the Salome Cave was an important shrine for pilgrims in the Byzantine era, you might well wonder how important it will be to people nowadays. After all, the question remains, how authentic is the claim that this is indeed the burial place of a woman who once bathed the infant Jesus? If you don't put any stock in early extra-canonical gospels, then chances are probably also pretty low that you believe in the authenticity of this cave. Furthermore, the fact that the main connection to Salome the Midwife in the first place is that there was probably at one point a box full of bones with her very common name on it might also add to the skepticism. And if you're skeptical, you're not alone. Most Protestants don't give much credence to traditions from outside the Protestant canon. And even many Catholics, who are generally more open to tradition as a source of teaching, are also hesitant to fully buy into the narrative from the infancy Gospel of James, or even the idea that Jesus had a midwife at all. No less an authority than St. Jerome himself once said, "No midwife assisted at his birth, no woman's officiousness intervened." But clearly, whatever the truth may be, Israeli tourism officials are hoping that enough people believe in Salome and are interested enough in visiting her shrine.
Perhaps late recognition for a forgotten female figure of the story of Jesus.